God sees Jesus, and that should be the instinct of us when we encounter students, is we should instinctively see God, see Jesus. Because if we see Jesus, then I would imagine we would probably treat people a little bit differently. We may not say some things that we want to say, or we'll be more conscious of how we interact with them. But I'll be honest, I don't always see every student that way. I try to, but I haven't got to the point where I can, always see every student, everyone instinctively. Now, basketball, I've been doing it, and maybe that's just a lack of my discipleship of not working at it. But basketball comes instinctively, and that should be the goal of inclusion, is to instinctively see it. I was having a conversation with someone, and we were talking about a college graduate. We were talking about higher ed. We were talking about a college graduation. At a particular school, everyone on the graduation stage was all white males. And the person said just instinctively they seen a problem with that. They said, but they think I was the only one that seen that problem. And that was because instinct is not that I don't believe anyone had ill will, but it wasn't instinctively. So what does this mean since we don't have instinct? That we have to be intentional about diversity, equity, and inclusion. If we're not intentional, 9 times out of 10, it's not going to organically happen because our minds aren't trained to see through that lens. So it's going to take some free throws of inclusion. It's going to take some suicides of inclusion. It's going to take some work in order for us to transform. So I'm not here today to tell you this is what you should do in every situation, in the classroom, in the workplace, with your colleagues. But what I am saying is that hopefully this webinar will help set the groundwork to start developing your lens so that you'll be able to see everyone as God sees us, as we see Christ. Because I think if we're all honest, at some point or time, we can all be a little bit judgmental. We can sometimes jump to, I won't speak for y'all, we can sometimes jump to assumptions, which we know don't always serve the best needs of our students. Instinct doesn't always come instinctively. And forgive me, I was supposed to change that time. I know that instinct and instinctively. But if you look over that, we'll focus on the points. Since instinct doesn't naturally come to everyone, it results in a need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've had conversations with people that said, well, we just need to keep it the same for everyone, an equal playing field. But what they fail to realize is that at certain institutions, especially at SNU, we're a predominantly white institution, that there are systems and structures in place that marginalize certain individuals and that don't create an equal playing field for all. So I wasn't I didn't help create the system. I don't agree with them. But whether you create them or not, there are still individuals who benefit for them. And this is why we have to be intentional about it. And it doesn't always mean that the people that created the systems or even that it was ill will behind the creation. But the reality is that it's not always equal playing field. And that's why we're having this, one of the reasons we're having this webinar today. So I want to first, before we dive really into inclusion, I really feel like diversity, equity, and inclusion are really just thrown around. They kind of group them all together. They use the common acronym DEI for it. But it's important that we recognize the differences between them. Diversity. This is the presence of differences within a given setting. Different race, different culture, different age, different demographic, regional locations. So diversity is just the presence of there being a difference. Equity is a process of ensuring that processes and programs are impartial, fair, and provide equal possible outcomes for every individual. Now, we know there isn't a perfect system, but that is the goal and strive of equity. Now, when we look at inclusion, this is the practice of ensuring that people feel a sense of belonging in the workplace. So feel a sense of belonging. As we go back to my story of, I was just grateful to any school to accept me because I wanted to play basketball that bad. Now, while I was on the team, I didn't feel, in some senses, I didn't feel welcome. I didn't feel valued. I didn't feel like the background that I came from was accepted. And this is why there is a need for inclusion. Now, when we think of inclusion, don't just think of it's black and white, literally white and black. Inclusion expands far beyond race, even as we look at disability. I had a student in one of my classes who was wheelchair bound. And what would happen is when he would come to the campus, it was practically impossible for him to be able to get into the bathroom. So what ended up happening was there was a note placed on the door that said, please keep this door open on these days. I don't think it gave any reason, but it said, please keep the door open. But while I feel that was a great stride, inclusion even pushes it further than that. I want to feel welcome, but I also want to feel that I belong. So what other things could have been done? Because I don't always read every sign that's on every wall. If someone shuts it, that could really cause an issue. So I'm not saying I have all the answers for it, but inclusion will push not only just making accommodation, but how do we make them feel like they're part of the group? You all may have been, for those who were in Royce Brown, may have remembered that, but what are some of you all's, does anyone have any recommendations of what could have been done to maybe be more inclusive? I'm not saying that was bad what we did. Does anyone have any other ideas of what could have been done? And there was a lot of thought that goes into it, so I understand no one has to answer right off the top of their head. But one thing that came to my mind was, getting something to permanently keep the door open. There are people that come in and out constantly, students, faculty, staff, students visiting, or there could have been, and I wasn't on the committee or decision-making process, I don't know what decisions went, but I talked to the students that had expressed to me that, the student really didn't feel included. And this is why I think is an important pivot point, is that, we don't always get it right. I'm not saying that was necessarily wrong, but we don't always get it right. But inclusion is ongoing. It isn't, okay, I come into my classroom, okay, I did my welcome, I took roll, I welcomed everybody, I told everyone this is an inclusive classroom. Inclusion is not a checklist of things to be done. It should be a lens that you see, and that's what I believe goes into being the instinct part of it. It becomes a part of your being. So when you see inequality, when you see people being marginalized, you naturally want to do something. You don't have to check the list off. But we're all sinful. We've all fallen short. And that's why we're here, to do the work and continue on. So the work of inclusion. So before we get to the classroom, before we get to our lesson plan, I think we first have to do some soul searching and start with self. I've heard stories. I've talked to different educators and administrators from different universities. And one thing that they expressed to me is, it's difficult sometimes recruiting faculty of color. And in certain areas, persons of color were already a minority, but recruitment, that says it's hard to find them. And what I've argued sometimes with them is that it's hard to find them if you don't know where they're at, if you don't know what they're engaged in. And this is why I think it starts with self and identifying what are some areas that I'm vulnerable. Sometimes having an accountability partner, or going to God and saying, God, can you reveal some areas in my life where I can be more inclusive? Is it with students that maybe even have learning disabilities? Is it with sex, male or female? Is it with background? We have a lot of students at SNU who are not saved. We even have some atheists. So what are those areas that I can be more inclusive in. Start with self, praying, God, will you reveal those? And through that process, God will reveal, I believe will reveal to you, but also will require you to be authentic. Students a lot of the time can see, faculty as well can see when we're not being authentic in class, when we're going through a checklist. However, being authentic can sometimes make you vulnerable. Well, how do you gauge that? Well, I believe that there are levels and spaces of vulnerability. There are some things that you and God need to work through in your pastor. But there are some things that we can share and walk through with our students. And we have more than enough well-versed and supportive people on our campus who can help walk through that process. So start with self, be authentic, because sometimes we'll identify, okay, that's a bias I have. I've kind of, been unfair in this practice. I, really shunned this student, or I wasn't fair in grading, or whatever the practice was. Allow some vulnerability. It's sometimes awkward. I've had this even in classes, and it's on, I think, my next slide where we mention specific strategies, but I talk about learning your student's name. Your student's name means a lot, and that's where it starts. And I've even struggled sometimes. I just have to ask, if I get this wrong, please forgive me, but correct me if necessary. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes it's a little bit awkward because they've told me 2 or 3 weeks in a row, but that's the vulnerability that it takes to really have an instinct towards inclusion. And lastly, it starts before class. Inclusion doesn't generally happen naturally, so we have to plan for it. And we're going to go through a few more strategies here shortly. Okay, so when we think about inclusive classrooms, they're affected by these 5 things, or these are some of the main areas that inclusive classrooms are affected by. First, your course content. So this includes what literature are we reading? Is the literature diverse from the authors that we see? And this, as I wrote courses, sometimes it can be difficult to find, if it's a specific topic or subject, find authors. But I think this is where it takes reaching out to, people that are in that field. And some people say, well, I'm not connected with a lot of people. Everyone knows how to use Google, right? Okay. Google, okay. Mm-hmm. Google will give you at least some recommendations of where to go to. And it's okay, I believe. Some people disagree. It's okay to ask, even some of your students who may be marginalized or excluded. But, and this is me venting, but we don't have all the answers. Some people have come to me and said, well, and I appreciate them asking for my input. They are trying to be inclusive, but don't go as, okay, tell me what to do. Go to the more of how can we work on this issue together? What are some ideas you have? What did I have? And I believe your posture and approach will definitely affect the outcome, and really their willingness to be able to work to you. Does my content, and remember, address all learning styles? And I know we all know the andragogy and pedagogy, but sometimes, at least I'm guilty of it, I get into a routine sometimes that I need to change. I've been teaching this class this way for 2 or 3 years now, and we get comfortable. But as our students evolve, especially as we look at adult students, I always say, in my adult program courses, I can't get them to shut up. But in my traditional classes, I can't get them to say anything. And this is what I think it takes, developing content that relates to those specific students. A second point that affects inclusive classrooms is prior assumptions and awareness of multicultural issues. If you have social media, if you watch the news, I'm sure you'll see a lot of multicultural issues. Whether you watch Fox or whether you watch CNN, whatever you watch, we can all, I think, identify some multicultural issues. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about it's hard to understand and comprehend, if we don't intentionally try to understand their backgrounds and where they came from. Things like microaggressions, things like code switching, colorism, all things that affect, most of the time, multicultural environment, as well as students and my marginalized students. Third, we have planning of class sessions. Are you intentional about how you use your time? Am I making sure that we know that some students, they don't like speaking a lot, but am I giving them platforms to engage, to contribute? So one thing that I do, or I've tried to, I don't do it every class, is sometimes I like to play Christian music, sometimes gospel music prior to class start, 10 minutes before class start. So what I'll do for some of my students who, are kind of keep to themselves, don't talk much, is I'll ask them, can you select a song that you like, a Christian gospel, something, motivational song that we can play before class? And a lot of times this will open up, an avenue for communication, but also for the student to feel that, what I believe and what I like is valued in the classroom. Now, it doesn't mean I always agree or like it, but I make them feel that, I respect it, and I want you to feel that you belong. Fourthly, knowledge of student backgrounds. For me, I've really, I think, grown the most with students and mentoring with students outside the classroom. Before class, after class, I've spent one student, I stayed with them 2 hours after class talking about how the student had lost their job, and were getting laid off, didn't know what they were going to do. And we actually sat there and started their business with them and had them set up their business. And I think this learning about student backgrounds can be very difficult at times. And I won't say every setting, but a lot of the time, one-on-one sessions are really most beneficial for those who don't want to divulge personal information. But it doesn't always have to be interpersonal. It can be elements such as where'd you grow up for? What background did you come from? Are you part of the Nazarene faith? What do you believe? And I believe that really creates a platform and environment for students to engage. And the last fifth one, I've kind of hinted on it, the professor's decisions, comments, and behaviors during the process of teaching. So actually in the act of teaching, decisions. I always, and I know we all probably do, go through our syllabus, but I set the ground rules at the beginning of class. But I'm guilty. I don't do it at every class. I try to, but I forgot one class, and I had a student who made a racial remark, and it wasn't a racial remark to me, but it was kind of a remark to himself, but he was similar to other students in the class. And I felt that, it was my responsibility that I didn't set clear that even if you're imposing on yourself, other people, that we don't allow that in the classroom. And because of that lack of, setting the groundwork, it resulted in that comment. So comments, behaviors. Students say some crazy things. I've heard some crazy things. But there's always room to develop and correct them. And I'll tell you, I wouldn't even say maybe correction. There's always room for interaction. But it's not always what we say, but how we say it. If a student says something wrong, I'll let them, I say, so if this happened, how would you handle the situation? Now, before I move on to my next slide, you don't have to wait till then. Are there any questions or comments? Inclusion is ongoing. Oh, sorry, that was So we talked about things that affect an inclusive classroom, but how do we create them? We don't assume, we see the best in our students. Remember, when a student walks through, we're seeing Jesus. We're not seeing the things that kind of make us be judgmental sometimes. Secondly, we develop our ILE vocabulary, intercultural learning and engagement. So things, as I mentioned, code switching, microaggressions, understanding. And when we seek inclusion, we're not seeking, for everyone to be the same. It's a reason why God created me this way, to look this way, to act this way. And just as God created you. Because as we try to be inclusive, that inclusion should never compromise who we are. Now, I should be respectful and welcoming, but I'm not compromising who I am to do that. And it can sometimes be difficult to navigate, to be respectful and even sometimes disagree, but feel welcoming at the same time. Third, develop heterogeneous groups. So what I did one time in the classroom, as we were looking at strategic planning, short-term goals, so 1 to 2 years. And this was right before the election. And we know anytime you talk politics, it can be difficult at times. But I believe, to be an effective business leader, it's important that we address those issues. So what I have my students do is I divide them up into groups. And I said, what I need you to do is I need you to assess the tax plan for if Joe Biden wins or if Donald Trump wins. And I said, how would this affect your business? And I kind of gave them criteria to look at because based on your political affiliation, we can sometimes be swayed inadvertently to see candidate or the policies, not in our accuracy. So what I had students do was I take that assessment, they did it. But what I did is I divided the students up and I told them who to assess and look at. And I had an issue where I had 3 students. It kind of got a little heated. I had 3 students who were Republicans and I had 1 student who was a Democrat. And what I was trying to do was assign them a person to analyze and try to be objective in looking at it. I'm not looking at, how it'll personally benefit you, but how it will benefit your business. But due to them imbalances, and there may have been a lack of me further investigating, but that 1 student, felt like, they really couldn't talk in the group because they kind of dominated the conversation. And this is why it's important, I think, when we develop those groups, that we try to be diverse as possible. Now, I didn't know anyone's affiliations, but what I had to do was interject myself and kind of help that student have a platform to say, okay, well, let's look at it this way. So it's not always going to be a perfect situation. We're not always going to have the answers, but it's an ongoing process. Okay. So if anyone needs a copy of the PowerPoint, please feel free to contact me.